He slammed his hand against the wall so hard, the entire room went silent. Master Sergeant Cole Maddox pointed his finger at the woman who had just walked into his training facility and said the words he would spend the rest of his career trying to take back. "Get her out of here." 9 Rangers turned and looked at her. She didn't move, she didn't flinch. She just looked at him and said quietly, "Start the clock." If this story already has you hooked, subscribe to our channel and follow every part to the end, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The morning started like every other morning at Fort Carson's underground evaluation complex, which meant it started with noise. Not the kind of noise that comes from chaos. The kind that comes from men who have spent years inside a system that rewards volume. Boots on concrete. Commands issued from the chest. Weight equipment dragged across floors. The sound of a culture that believed loudness was proof of strength and silence was proof of weakness. Master Sergeant Cole Maddox ran his assessment unit the way he ran everything else in his life at full throttle, with zero tolerance for anything he considered soft. He was 41 years old. He had 3 combat deployments on his record, 2 commendations for valor, and a philosophy about warfare that he had carried since his first year in the Ranger program. The soldier who controls the space controls the outcome. You did not wait. You did not think. You moved first, hit hardest, and let the other side figure out what happened. It was a philosophy that had served him well, in the field, in training, in every evaluation he had ever run. What it had not prepared him for was a Tuesday morning in November, when a woman he had never seen before walked through the security door at the south end of the complex, and stood there completely still, holding a small black equipment case in her right hand. He noticed her from across the room because she didn't fit. That was the only word for it. She didn't fit the noise. She didn't fit the movement. She stood in the middle of all that activity, like something that had been placed there by accident, and every soldier in the room noticed it at roughly the same moment Maddox did, because the room got quieter. Not silent, just quieter. She was medium height, dark hair pulled back in a regulation bun. She wore a standard Army service uniform with no visible tab on her shoulder sleeve, no Ranger designation, no combat infantryman badge, no unit patch that any of the soldiers recognized. She carried no rifle. She had no tactical team with her. She had nothing except that small equipment case and an expression that if Maddox had been paying closer attention, would have told him everything he needed to know about what kind of morning he was about to have. But he wasn't paying that kind of attention yet. He was still in the phase where he was deciding which kind of problem she was. "Hey." He raised his voice across the floor. "This is a restricted training facility. Access requires authorization from unit command." She looked at him directly. Not nervously, not apologetically. She looked at him the way a surgeon looks at a resident who has just asked a basic question. "Captain Elena Cross," she said. "I have authorization. I submitted credentials through Colonel Reeves's office yesterday afternoon." Maddox pulled his tablet out of his vest pocket and scrolled through the morning access list. Her name was there. He found it on the 3rd scroll near the bottom, listed without a unit designation, without a specialty code, without any of the usual information that told you who a person was before they walked into your room. He looked up from the tablet. "What's the nature of your visit, Captain?" "Evaluation," she said. "Evaluation of what?" "The simulation system. And the personnel running it." The room got quieter again. Sergeant First Class Danny Ortega, who was standing 8 feet from Maddox and had been part of the assessment unit for 4 years, caught the change in the air immediately. He glanced at the 2 junior Rangers closest to him and shook his head slightly, a small warning that went unheeded by both of them. One of the junior Rangers, a 26-year-old named Hicks, who still had the kind of confidence that comes before a person has been truly humbled by anything, said it out loud. "She's here to evaluate us." He didn't whisper it. He said it at normal volume, and the slight rise in his voice at the end, the barely contained amusement carried across the room. Elena heard it. She turned her head and looked at Hicks for exactly 2 seconds. Not threatening, not defensive. She looked at him the way you look at a clock to check the time briefly for information, and then you look away. She turned back to Maddox. "Is the simulation system currently active?" "It runs at 0800, he said. "That's 40 minutes. Good." She set the equipment case down on the nearest bench and opened it. Inside was a compact laptop, a standard-issue sidearm in a secured holder, and a set of gear she began laying out methodically on the bench surface. Then I have time to review the current course configuration before we start. Maddox stood very still for a moment. He was trying to decide if this was something he needed to escalate or something he could simply absorb into the morning and manage on his terms. Colonel Reeves had approved her access. That meant pushing back directly was above his authority. But the way she was already moving through his space, setting up at his bench, reviewing his course without asking anyone's permission, that created a different kind of problem. The kind of problem that existed entirely in his chest. He walked over to where Ortega was standing. "You know anything about this?" he said low. "Nothing," Ortega said. "Name's not in any of our usual channels, no unit tag. No specialty code I recognize." She said Colonel Reeves's office. "Then she's real," Ortega said quietly. "Doesn't tell us what she is." Maddox looked across the room at Elena, who was reviewing something on her laptop screen, with the same complete focus she might have given a map in a forward operating base. She wasn't watching the Rangers. She wasn't managing their reactions. She was working. That bothered him more than anything else so far. He walked over. "Captain Cross." He stopped close enough that most people would have looked up. She didn't. "I run this facility. Whatever your evaluation parameters are, I need to understand them before we proceed." She typed something, then closed the laptop. She looked up at him. "The evaluation is performance-based," she said. "I'll run the standard course scenario. You'll observe. Your team's reaction to a non-standard operator in the environment is part of the data. You're going to run the course yourself." "Yes." "You're aware this course was designed for Ranger-qualified personnel." "I'm aware of what the course was designed for." Maddox crossed his arms. There it was, the moment that defined everything that followed. He had a choice. He could have asked a different question. He could have said quietly, "What is your background?" "Captain Cross, what have you done? Why does Colonel Reeves know your name?" He could have gathered information before forming a conclusion. Instead, he formed the conclusion first. "With respect, Captain, this isn't an environment where a woman belongs," she said. Flat. No accusation, just the words delivered with the same temperature as everything else she'd said. "Where someone without the appropriate training qualifications belongs," he said. "We don't run observers through live simulation scenarios. It's a liability issue." "I'm not an observer," she said. "And the liability authorization is included in the credentials Colonel Reeves approved. You have it in your tablet." He looked. He found it. A single-line authorization at the bottom of the access record that he had scrolled past without reading. His jaw tightened. She watched him find it. She didn't say anything. He put the tablet away. "Fine," he said. "We'll run the scenario as standard. But I'm going to need you to understand that the operators in this exercise are going to perform at full capacity. We don't scale back because of what?" she said. And this time her voice was slightly softer, which made it somehow sharper. "I haven't asked you to scale anything back, Sergeant." A long pause. "No," he said. "You haven't." He turned and walked back to Ortega. "Get 9 people ready." He said quiet enough that she wouldn't hear the specific number. "Best we have. I want the 3 from Bravo team in the final position." Ortega looked at him sideways. 9 people against 1. She wants a performance evaluation. We'll give her one. Ortega held his breath for a second. "You want me to log this as standard procedure?" "Log it as an authorized scenario evaluation," Maddox said. "Which it is." Ortega didn't argue. But he turned away from Maddox before Maddox could see his face. At 800, the simulation began. What most people in that facility didn't know, what Maddox certainly didn't know because he hadn't asked the right questions, was that Elena Cross had been awake since 4 a.m. Not because she was nervous, because she was thorough. She had spent 3 hours reviewing every variation of the Fort Carson Underground Evaluation course that existed in the Army's simulation database. She knew its 12 decision points. She knew the standard Ranger patrol tactics that most operators defaulted to when running positions 2 through 7. She knew the acoustic properties of the corridor network well enough to understand that sound traveled differently in the East Wing than in the West, and that a soldier trained primarily in open-terrain operations would unconsciously compensate in ways that created predictable positioning errors. She had not done this because she was afraid of 9 Rangers. She had done it because she never walked into any room without having already walked through it in her head. That was the thing about Elena Cross that the people watching her from the observation deck could not have understood from looking at her. She did not operate the way they expected. She was not slow, but her speed was not the first thing you noticed. She was not reckless, but she was also not cautious in the way that most people mean when they use that word. She was precise. She was economical. Every decision she made in a tactical environment was the product of a calculation that had already happened several seconds before the decision became necessary. She had learned this partly from training, but mostly from a night 3 years ago in a country she was not allowed to name, where a Ranger team of 6 had become separated from their extraction point in a communications blackout. And the only person who could reconstruct their position from fragmentary data and get them out before the window closed was a 29-year-old intelligence captain named Elena Cross, who had never fired a weapon in a live combat environment before that night. She didn't talk about that night. It wasn't modesty. It was simply that the people who needed to know about it already knew, and the people who didn't know didn't matter yet. The course stretched across 4 levels of the underground facility. Entry was at the north end. Extraction point was a marked door at the south end of the 4th level. Between entry and extraction were 12 decision points, variable environmental conditions, and today 9 Rangers, whose only mission was to stop her from reaching the door. She entered at 800 with a standard sidearm loaded with training rounds and a communication earpiece she immediately removed and placed in her left breast pocket. She didn't want to hear anything from outside the building. She wanted to hear what was inside. The first thing she heard was breathing. Not her own. Someone else's. The corridor she entered had a 90-degree turn 40 feet ahead. Standard tactical doctrine, the kind that Ranger training hammered into every operator in the program, called for a position just past the corner, angled for maximum coverage of the approach. It was a logical position. It was almost always the correct position, which meant it was the first place she expected someone to be. She stopped 8 feet before the corner, stood completely still, breathed slowly, counted. She heard the slight shift of weight, the sound of a boot sole compressing under a body making a small adjustment. Someone had been holding their position for a while and was beginning to feel it in their knees. She felt no urgency about this. She removed a small training marker from her vest, a circular disc roughly the size of a hockey puck, used in simulation exercises to tag positions, and rolled it gently along the floor toward the corner. The sound of the disc on concrete was enough. The Ranger on the other side reacted the way someone reacts when they hear an unexpected sound in a space they've been told to hold a small, involuntary shift in weight. A breath held and then released. She heard the direction. She moved. She came around the corner, not where the Ranger expected, not from the center of the corridor, but from the far left low, already positioned past his angle of coverage. The training round landed in his chest before he had time to fully reacquire his line. He looked down at the paint mark on his vest. He looked up at her. She was already moving. In the observation room, one of the junior soldiers said, "How did she know he was there?" Nobody answered. Dead. The 2nd and 3rd Rangers had positioned themselves as a coordinated pair. This was standard Ranger small unit methodology, 2-man covering positions with overlapping fields of observation designed so that any attempt to neutralize one automatically exposed the attacker to the other. It was a good system for someone who didn't notice details. Elena noticed the shadow. It appeared beneath a door on the left side of the corridor, a thin strip of darkness interrupted by the outline of 2 feet. The door opened inward, which meant the person behind it was pressed against the interior wall, which meant they were going to emerge into the corridor rather than engage from a fixed position. That made them the closer threat. But the door was a distraction. The real threat was in the room to the right, where the ventilation grate on the upper wall was vibrating at a frequency that shouldn't have existed in a room where nothing was moving. Someone was breathing close to the duct opening. Someone who was trying very hard to breathe quietly and had not considered that the duct would amplify it. She neutralized the door threat first fast and closed the moment he began to move. The second ranger, the one near the vent, came out of the room at the sound of the training round and found her already past his expected position inside his defensive angle, where his weapon could not effectively cover her without swinging across his own body. 2 seconds. Both eliminated. She kept moving. In the observation room, the conversation had completely stopped. Maddox was watching the monitor with an expression that the people around him could not quite read. It wasn't anger yet. It was the particular kind of stillness that comes before a person recognizes that something they believed is beginning to fail. Ortega stood next to him and said nothing. He had watched something similar once before, a combat applications group officer running a selection course at a different facility doing things with positioning and prediction that made everyone in the room feel like they'd been practicing the wrong version of the skill. But that was different. That was an operator everyone knew by reputation going in. This was a woman nobody in this building had heard of an hour ago. So, the fourth ranger had been briefed by his 2 teammates before the exercise. Or rather, he had been briefed by the fact that they'd had 30 seconds to update the team channel before she neutralized both of them, and what he knew was, she's fast, and she doesn't come from the angle you expect. He adjusted his position accordingly. He moved away from the logical cover point. He chose an unconventional placement behind a support column that placed him at a diagonal to the corridor, a position that gave him coverage of 2 approaches simultaneously, and reduced his exposure profile to nearly nothing. It was a smart adjustment. Elena stopped at the entrance to the section. She scanned. She didn't see him immediately, and she knew what that meant. He'd thought about it. He'd changed something, which meant the logical position was empty, and the column was more likely than the alcove, because the column provided 3 points of cover versus the alcove's 2. She didn't rush the analysis. The clock was running, but rushing an analysis to save 10 seconds and then dying for it was not efficiency. It was just a faster way to fail. She took a different route through the section, a path that added distance, but placed her behind the column rather than in front of it. He heard her coming from the wrong direction and turned. By the time he turned, she had already solved the angle. Training round. Center mass. Clean. He sat down against the wall and said quietly and with genuine admiration, "How?" She didn't answer. She was already gone. Maddox slammed his hand flat on the monitoring desk. "Where is she?" The soldier managing the tracking feed pointed to the display. "Level 2. She's ahead of the standard pace by about 4 minutes. 4 minutes. He said it like a number that didn't make sense. That's not possible. The course was designed with specific time constraints based on the average movement rate of a Ranger-qualified operator, yes, sir," the tracking soldier said. He was very careful with his voice. "She's running ahead of that average." Maddox turned and looked at the monitor showing the overall course map. 5 down, 4 remaining. He grabbed the internal communication line. "Bravo team. She's moving faster than the standard model. Adjust your timings by 4 minutes and tighten the corridor position. Do not give her room on the left side. She favors the left." On the other side of the communication line, Sergeant First Class Ramon Caldwell, leader of the 3-man Bravo team that Maddox had placed in the final section, heard the instruction and felt something he didn't often feel in training exercises. He felt genuinely uncertain. "Copy that," he said. "We'll be ready." But he also turned to his 2 teammates and said quietly off the radio, "Tighten up and think. This one's not running the standard pattern." Elena moved through the middle sections of the course the way she moved through everything, not slowly, but not at full sprint either. She was managing her energy, managing her information. Every corner she cleared, every room she passed through, added to the picture she was building of what was ahead. She also noticed something interesting. She noticed that the Ranger positions she was clearing were getting slightly better. Not dramatically, but the adjustments were real. Someone in the observation room was relaying information to the remaining operators, coaching them in real time based on what she was doing. That was technically within the rules of the exercise. She didn't object to it. What it told her was that Maddox was watching closely enough to feel threatened. which meant he was also close enough to the situation to start making the kind of error that people make when they're watching something happen that they don't want to accept. He was giving his people information based on what she had already done, rather than what she was about to do. He was one step behind. And one step behind in a scenario like this was the same as being a full lap behind. She filed this information and kept moving. The 6th Ranger she neutralized in a stairwell. The 7th had taken a position that was genuinely creative under a false floor panel in a room she had to cross, and he nearly caught her. Nearly. She felt the shift in the flooring before she committed her full weight to it, pulled her step short, and adjusted her path 2 inches to the right enough that when he came up through the panel, she was already past him. He emerged into empty space and found the training round on his shoulder blade. He sat back down through the panel and said a word that wasn't in any military manual. 8 down. The course was narrowing toward the final section. She could feel it. The air changed. The acoustics changed. 3 Rangers ahead of her in a position that the entire observation room had watched Maddox carefully orchestrate. She stopped outside the entrance to the final level and stood completely still. She listened. Not for sound. For the absence of sound. Because 3 trained Rangers holding a defensive position in a space this size should have produced some sound by now. Some small vibration, some movement, some breath. And she heard nothing. Which meant they were very good at being still. Or they had positioned themselves in a place where their sound didn't carry back through the corridor she was standing in. She closed her eyes. She thought about the facility's layout, the final level, the position of the extraction point, the angles of approach, the places where 3 people could establish overlapping coverage and also maintain the kind of acoustic discipline that produced this quality of silence. She opened her eyes. She had it. They weren't distributed across the level the way the standard course configuration suggested. They had pulled back and consolidated 3 people tight position maximum coverage of the final corridor betting that concentration was better than distribution against a single operator who had beaten everyone else. It was objectively the right call. She took a slow breath, and she began to move. In the observation room, nobody was talking. Maddox stood at the front of the group with his arms folded and his jaw set, watching the tracking display as Elena's marker moved across the bottom level toward the consolidated Bravo team position. He had said nothing in 4 minutes. The soldiers around him had matched his silence without anyone suggesting it the way a room matches the temperature of the person commanding it. Ortega stood slightly behind him and slightly to the right, watching both the display and Maddox's face. He had known Cole Maddox for 7 years. He had watched him angry, had watched him exhausted, had watched him make mistakes and correct them and make them again. He had never watched him look like this. Like a man in the process of revising something he built his whole career on. "She's going to try the direct approach," one of the monitoring soldiers said. "The extraction point is straight through the Bravo position. Only way in." Maddox didn't respond. He knew it wasn't going to be the direct approach. He knew it, and he couldn't explain how he knew it, except that nothing she had done in the last 40 minutes had been the direct approach. On the display, her marker stopped. Just outside the Bravo team's coverage zone. 30 seconds passed. Then a minute. Ortega leaned forward slightly. "What's she doing?" Nobody answered. And then the marker moved not toward the extraction point, but at a diagonal toward the eastern wall of the level. A direction that, according to the course map, led nowhere. Maddox felt his stomach drop. Because he was looking at the course map, and she was looking at the building. 3 years of sitting with the simulation design database had given Elena something that no amount of Ranger training could. She knew where the original architectural plans of the facility diverged from the simulation course overlay. She knew which walls on the course map were solid and which were modified partitions installed during the facility's renovations 6 years ago. She knew because she had spent 40 hours in that database reviewing exactly the kind of detail that nobody reviewed unless they were looking for it specifically. The eastern wall of the final level had one partition section, 8 feet wide. Original renovation record logged it as temporary, but never updated the status to permanent, which meant it was plasterboard over a steel frame, which meant it was not rated for impact resistance. She wasn't going through the defended corridor, she was going through the wall. The first sound Bravo team heard was not what they expected. It was a short contained impact against the wall to their right, followed immediately by a breach that bypassed their entire defensive position, and then she was behind them. Inside their coverage arc, already past their weapons angles, already at the extraction door. Sergeant Caldwell turned and looked at her. She was already touching the door. The timer read 0130. The screen in the observation room displayed all targets neutralized, 0 hits received, perfect execution. Caldwell stood very still in the dust of the partitioned wall, and looked at the extraction door, and looked at Elena Cross, and understood with complete clarity that the exercise had ended the moment she had started thinking about the eastern wall, probably 2 minutes before she moved, possibly more. They had been finished before they knew the game had changed. He looked at his two teammates. Nobody said anything. Then Caldwell said slowly, "She went through the wall." "She went through the wall," the second ranger confirmed. "Does the course allow—" "The course doesn't explicitly prohibit structural breach," Elena said from the doorway. She wasn't breathing hard. "It prohibits damage to course equipment. The partition was not course equipment. It was building infrastructure." Caldwell looked at her for a long moment. "Who are you?" he said. It wasn't a challenge. It was a genuine question asked with genuine respect. She held his gaze. "Someone who's been in this building longer than you have," she said. And then she opened the extraction door and walked through. The timer locked at 90 seconds. And in the observation room above, Master Sergeant Cole Maddox stared at the display and did not speak for a very long time while the room around him waited for a reaction that didn't come because the man who had spent his entire career being certain had just run out of certainty. And the morning wasn't even over. The extraction door swung shut behind her. For 3 full seconds, nobody in the observation room moved. Not Maddox, not Ortega. Not the monitoring soldiers whose job it was to log results and update the performance record. Everyone stood exactly where they were looking at a screen that had already delivered its verdict, as if looking away from it would make the verdict more real. Then someone in the back of the room let out a slow breath. That was the thing that broke it open. Because once one person breathed, everyone else did too, and then the room came back to life all at once, chairs scraping keyboards, clicking voices finding their way back. But it was a different room than it had been 90 seconds ago. Everyone in it knew that. Nobody said it out loud. Maddox turned from the display and walked toward the door without speaking. Ortega moved to follow him, and Maddox held up one hand. Not angry, not commanding, just a gesture that meant not now. And Ortega stopped and watched him go through the door alone. The monitoring soldier at the tracking desk looked at the performance record on his screen and then looked at the soldier beside him. "Do I log this as a standard result?" he said quietly. The second soldier looked at the screen for a moment. "Log it exactly as it happened," she said. "That's all we do." He nodded and started typing, and the room settled into the particular silence of people who had just watched something they were going to be thinking about for a long time. Sergeant First Class Danny Ortega stood at the back of the observation room and looked at the closed door where Maddox had gone, and then at the course display where Elena's marker sat stationary at the extraction point, and he felt something he hadn't expected to feel this morning. He felt relieved. Not because he disliked Maddox, he didn't. Cole Maddox was one of the better soldiers he had served with, complicated and demanding and sometimes wrong in ways that cost people, but fundamentally committed to the work in a way that Ortega respected. What he felt relieved about was simpler than that he felt relieved that it was over. That whatever was going to happen from here on was going to happen in the open, in front of people where it could be dealt with honestly. Because Ortega had known from the moment Elena Cross walked in through that south door that the morning was going to end somewhere difficult. He just hadn't known exactly how difficult until now. He pulled out his phone and looked at the contact number Colonel Reeves's office had forwarded to the unit roster 48 hours ago, the one nobody had paid attention to because it was attached to an access authorization that nobody had read carefully. Then he put his phone away because the colonel would know soon enough. Everything that happened in this facility eventually reached the colonel. That was simply how the building worked. Elena came through the south door of the course level and found Sergeant First Class Ramon Caldwell waiting in the corridor. He was leaning against the wall with his arms folded and his helmet off, holding it in one hand. His two Bravo teammates were behind him, and all three of them had the specific expression of men who have just been comprehensively outmaneuvered and are still in the process of deciding how they feel about it. She stopped when she saw them. "Sergeant," she said. "Captain?" He straightened from the wall. I wasn't sure if I should say this, but I figured I'd rather say it than not." He paused. "That was the best I've seen anyone move through this course, and I've been running it for 3 years." She looked at him steadily. "Your positioning was good. Consolidating instead of distributing was the right call." "It was the right call against the wrong problem," he said. "You weren't running the course. You were running the building." "I was running whatever gave me the best path to the door," she said. "That's the same thing," Caldwell said. "That's exactly the same thing, and most people in this facility have never figured that out." He hesitated. "Can I ask you something?" "Yes." "The eastern wall, the partition. How long had you known about that before you used it?" She considered the question the way she considered everything briefly, completely without hurry. "Since approximately 4:15 this morning," she said. Caldwell absorbed that. He turned to his two teammates and the younger of the two, a ranger named Weiss, who was 24 and still in that stage of development where he was learning faster than he was able to admit, let out a sound that wasn't quite a laugh and wasn't quite the opposite. "She studied the architectural plans," Weiss said, "at 4 a.m. 4:15, Elena said. Weiss looked at her with an expression that was part disbelief and part something that might eventually become the right kind of respect. "Why?" "Because I was going to be in the building," she said. "And I don't go into buildings I don't understand." A short silence. Caldwell nodded slowly. "Fair enough." He put his helmet back on. "For what it's worth, Captain, and I mean this with complete sincerity, I'm glad you're on our side." She looked at him for a moment. "I've always been on your side," she said. "That's why I'm here." She walked past them toward the equipment room, and Caldwell watched her go, and when she turned the corner, he looked at Weiss, and Weiss looked at him, and neither one of them said anything, because there wasn't a version of what they were thinking that translated well into words. Maddox found a supply corridor on the second level and stood in it for 7 minutes doing nothing. He wasn't angry. That was the part that confused him, because anger would have been simple. And he was very familiar with anger, knew exactly how it moved through him, and where it settled, and how long it took to clear. This wasn't that. This was something that sat in his sternum, and didn't move in any direction. Didn't build, and didn't release, just stayed there like a stone that had been placed with deliberate precision. He had set 9 Rangers against her. 9. He had done it because he was certain she would fail, and he had wanted the failure to be comprehensive and visible, the kind that made a point without him having to make it directly. He had wanted the facility to see it. He had wanted the morning to end with everyone in the room confirmed in their understanding of what belonged here and what didn't. Instead, he had given her a stage. He put his back against the wall and looked at the ceiling. The thing that kept turning over in his chest wasn't the loss itself. He had lost training exercises before. Every instructor lost training exercises. It was how the system was supposed to work. What kept turning was the specific quality of the loss. It wasn't close. It wasn't a matter of her getting through by a narrow margin by luck, by one good decision in the right moment. She had moved through 9 of his best people the way a person moves through a problem they have already solved, without urgency, without waste. With the kind of patience that only exists when someone is completely confident in the outcome, and he had been the one to give her the opportunity to demonstrate it. He pushed off from the wall and started walking. He needed to find Colonel Reeves before Colonel Reeves found him. The Colonel found him first. That was how it always worked when the Colonel was involved, and Maddox had known that, so he was not entirely surprised when he came around the corner at the base of the main stairwell and found Colonel Daniel Reeves standing there with 2 copies of the performance report already in his hand. One printed, one on his tablet, and an expression that Maddox had learned over 8 years of serving under this man meant that several things were about to be said that would feel like being taken apart at the joints. "Walk with me," Reeves said. They walked. For a minute and a half the Colonel said nothing. He simply moved through the corridor with the performance report in his hand, and Maddox walked beside him and waited because he had also learned that interrupting this particular silence was never the right choice. Then Reeves stopped. He turned to face Maddox directly. 90 seconds, he said. Yes, sir. 0 hits received. Yes, sir. Perfect execution. That's what the system logged. Yes, sir. Reeves looked at him for a long moment. I want you to tell me what you were thinking when you assigned 9 operators to this exercise. Maddox held the colonel's gaze. He had 2 options here, and he knew it. He could manage the conversation. Choose his words carefully. Give the colonel the version that minimized the exposure. Or he could say what was actually true. He chose the second one. Not because it was easier, it was considerably harder, but because he was tired of the weight in his sternum, and he recognized somewhere below his conscious decision-making that the only way to put it down was to stop carrying it quietly. I wanted her to fail in front of the room, he said. I assigned 9 operators because I was certain she couldn't handle it, and I wanted the certainty to be visible. Reeves said nothing. I was wrong, Maddox said. The colonel looked at him for another moment. Then he turned and continued walking, and Maddox fell back into step beside him. Captain Cross submitted her access credentials through my office 36 hours ago, Reeves said. Did you read the full authorization record? Not completely. No, sir. If you had read it completely, you would have found her background summary. Reeves paused. She holds a graduate degree in applied decision science from Johns Hopkins. She completed advanced combative certification at Fort Bragg in 2021, top of her class. She has a classified performance record from 3 overseas deployments that I am not going to detail in this corridor, but which I will summarize by telling you that her commendation file takes 11 minutes to read at normal pace. He stopped again. She also authored 30% of the simulation decision architecture that this facility runs on. The tactical pattern recognition model your Rangers have been training against for the last 2 years, she built the underlying framework for that model. Maddox stopped walking. He stood very still. She built the course, he said. Not a question. She built the system the course runs on, Reeves said, which is slightly different from building the course, and considerably more significant. He turned to look at Maddox directly. She knows every decision tree embedded in the simulation. She knows every bias in the standard operator response model. She has spent more hours in the behavioral database for this training system than anyone currently serving in this facility. He paused. And she also knows the building, because she reviewed the architectural records before she came in this morning. Maddox said nothing. He was processing the specific shape of what he had done. Not just the public failure, not just the 9 Rangers, but the particular arrogance of having dismissed in under 30 seconds a person whose competence existed so far beyond his own assumptions that he had never even gotten close to seeing the real edges of it. She didn't say any of this, Maddox said finally. No, Reeves said. She didn't. She let me set the exercise up without telling me who she was. Reeves looked at him. What would you have done if she'd told you? A long pause. I don't know, Maddox said. And that was the most honest thing he had said all morning. Yes, you do, Reeves said, not unkindly. You would have treated her differently, and the data from the exercise would have been contaminated because it wouldn't have reflected your genuine reaction to a non-standard operator in your environment. He paused. That was the evaluation, Cole, not just her performance. Your reaction was the evaluation. The weight in Maddox's sternum moved for the first time all morning. It moved downward, settled differently, the way something settles when you finally understand its shape. What does the record say? He said. About my reaction. It says what it says, Reeves replied. I'm more interested in what you're going to do with it. In the equipment room off the main training floor, Elena Cross was cleaning her sidearm. She did this with the methodical focus she applied to everything that required precision, breaking it down, running the cleaning rod through the barrel, reassembling in the same order every time, checking the slide, checking the magazine release, returning everything to its original condition. She had been doing this since she was 23 years old, and she had never once shortened the process, or done it careless because she was tired or distracted. Discipline was not a feeling. It was a habit repeated until it was simply the way things were done. Hicks walked in. She heard him before she saw him. The particular hesitation in the footstep of someone who has rehearsed an entrance and is now second-guessing it. She didn't look up from the cleaning cloth. He stood in the doorway for a moment. Then he came in and sat down on the bench across from her, uninvited but not hostile, which she noted. "I'm the one who said it," he said. "Before the exercise. I was the one who said it loud enough for everyone to hear." She continued with the cleaning cloth. "I heard you," she said. "Yeah." He put his hands on his knees. "I figured." A pause. "You want to tell me you're sorry," she said. "I am sorry. I know." She set down the cleaning cloth and looked at him properly for the first time. He was young enough that the expression on his face was a mixture of genuine remorse and the particular discomfort of a person who has not yet learned how to sit quietly inside their own mistakes. "You don't need to apologize to me, Hicks." He looked confused. "I said something. You said what you were thinking. That's not the problem." She picked up the cloth again. "The problem is what you were thinking, and that's not something an apology fixes." He sat with that for a moment. "How does it get fixed?" he said. She considered the question. "Time," she said, "and paying attention to what you see instead of what you expect." She set the sidearm back in its case. "You expected me to be one thing when I walked in. When I turned out to be something else, your first response was discomfort. That discomfort is the signal. It means your model of what belongs somewhere doesn't match reality, and reality is always the one that's right." Hicks nodded slowly. He looked like someone in the early stages of a process that was going to take a while. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Yes." "Did it bother you? What I said, what any of us said?" She thought about it honestly, the way she thought about everything. "Yes," she said. "And no, it bothered me the way it always bothers me, not because it's new, but because it's still happening. Because I've been doing this work for 8 years, and I still walk into rooms where the first thing people see when they look at me is the question of whether I belong. That doesn't go away. You get better at working around it, but it doesn't go away." Hicks sat with that. "I'm sorry," he said again, quieter this time. "I know," she said again. But this time it landed differently. She closed the equipment case. "Get better at what you assume," she told him. "That's all. Not for my benefit, for yours. Because the next time you're wrong about someone, it might not be a training exercise." He stood up. He looked like he wanted to say something else but couldn't find the right shape for it. "Yes, ma'am," he said finally. And he meant it in the way that actually means something. He left. She sat for a moment with the closed equipment case in front of her and thought about nothing in particular, which was the way she rested when she could. She had said the truth to Hicks, and the truth had cost her something the way truth always costs something when you say it out loud, instead of carrying it in silence. But it had also done what truth does when it lands in the right place. It had opened something. She could see it in his face when he walked out. Not transformation. One conversation doesn't transform anyone. But a crack in something that had been solid. That was enough for now. At 10:30, Colonel Reeves assembled the full assessment unit in the facility's main briefing room. All 9 Rangers, every monitoring soldier, every support staff member who had been in the building that morning. 41 people in a room that fit 50. And every single one of them knew what this meeting was about before the colonel said a word. Elena sat in the second row. Not at the front, not at the back. She had chosen her seat the way she chose everything, without spectacle, without positioning, with straightforward practicality. Maddox sat in the front row. He had not looked at her since entering the room. Not because he was avoiding her, she didn't think that was it. She thought it was more specific than avoidance. She thought he was doing something internal that required his attention, and external input wasn't what he needed right now. She recognized this because she had seen it before in people who were in the middle of revising something fundamental. It looked like absence, but it was actually the opposite. It was complete presence inside a very difficult process. Colonel Reeves stood at the front of the room without notes. He was 63 years old, and had been in the Army for 38 of them. He had a way of addressing a room that had nothing theatrical in it. No raised voice, no dramatic pause, no performance. He simply said what was true, in a sequence that left no room for misunderstanding. "This morning, this facility conducted an evaluation exercise under my authorization," he said. "Captain Elena Cross ran the standard course scenario against 9 operators selected by Master Sergeant Maddox. The result was a perfect execution with a completion time of 90 seconds. He let that sit for a moment. "I'm going to tell you who Captain Cross is because most of you don't know, and because what happened this morning doesn't mean what it should mean until you understand the context." The room was absolutely still. Captain Cross is the lead tactical analyst for the Army Combat Simulation Development Program. She has spent the last 4 years building, refining, and testing the decision architecture system that powers the training simulations used in this facility and 11 others across the continental United States. The behavioral models your Rangers practice against, the tactical patterns the simulation generates, the escalation sequences, the decision trees she built, the underlying framework for all of it. A very specific kind of silence fell over the room. The kind that comes when information lands on a group of people simultaneously, and each of them is processing it privately, which means the room gets quiet in a way that is different from ordinary quiet. Caldwell in the 3rd row looked straight ahead. Weiss beside him exhaled very slowly. The monitoring soldier who had asked about logging the result looked at his hands. Hicks, sitting in the 4th row, looked at the floor and kept his eyes there. "What that means," Reeves continued, "is that Captain Cross knew the simulation system from the inside before she entered this building. She also reviewed the facility's architectural records prior to arrival, which is how she identified the partition access point in the final section." He looked across the room. "She did not do any of this to embarrass this unit. She did it because she is thorough, and because thoroughness is the basis of her work. Everything she did this morning, she did the way she does everything completely, and with full preparation." He paused. "But I want to be clear about something else," he said. "Knowing the simulation architecture is an advantage. It is not the only reason she completed that course. The decision-making, the acoustic awareness, the tactical adaptability, those are not products of database access. Those are products of 8 years of deliberate development and 3 overseas deployments, with a classified performance record that I am going to summarize in 1 sentence. She was asked twice to enter situations where the standard answer was, 'It can't be done,' and both times she did it." Maddox in the front row did not move. He was listening with the specific quality of attention that a person brings to information they know they should have had long before now. "Captain Cross was not sent here to replace anyone," Reeves said. "She was sent here to evaluate the simulation system's current performance against real-world operator behavior. Today's exercise was part of that evaluation. The data she collected will be used to improve the training model." He looked around the room one more time. What happened this morning in the moments before that exercise, the comments, the assumptions, the decision to field 9 operators against 1, that data was also collected, because it is also part of the evaluation. The room absorbed this. Then Reeves said, "Dismissed." People began to stand, and the room filled with the sound of movement, but it was slow movement, the kind that happens when people are still thinking more than they're walking. Hicks stood up and looked across the room at Elena, who was gathering her equipment case from beside her chair. She didn't look back at him. Not because she was punishing him, because she had already said what she needed to say, and she was already thinking about the next problem. That was the thing about her that nobody in this room had understood before today, and most of them were only beginning to understand now. She was always already thinking about the next problem. Ortega fell into step beside Maddox as they moved toward the door. "You okay?" he said quietly. Maddox was quiet for a moment. "I was wrong about her," he said. "Yes?" Ortega said, not unkindly. "I was wrong in front of the whole unit." "Yes." Another pause. "That's going to have to be enough to start with," Maddox said. "Knowing I was wrong." Ortega looked at him sideways. "It's a start," he said. "Yeah." They went through the door, and in the hallway outside the briefing room, the morning's work began to settle into the structure of something that everyone present would carry forward, not as a story about failure, but as something more durable and more useful than that. As the beginning of a correction. As the first moment of something that hadn't been there before. And it was barely past 10:30 in the morning. The hallway outside the briefing room cleared in under 3 minutes. That was fast, even for this unit. Usually after a colonel's address, there was a residue of conversation in the corridor. Small clusters, low voices, the particular social processing that happens when a group of people has received difficult information and needs to turn it into something they can work with. Today, there was almost none of that. People moved with their heads down and their thoughts turned inward, which told Elena more about the morning's impact than any debrief summary would have. She let the corridor empty before she moved. She had learned this a long time ago, not as a strategy, not as a way of avoiding people, but simply as a practice of good information gathering. The way people behaved in the first 5 minutes after a significant event told you things about them that hours of formal interaction couldn't. Who walked alone? Who sought company immediately? Who looked for Maddox and who deliberately went in the opposite direction? Who paused at the corner and looked back toward the briefing room before committing to a direction? Hicks went left alone quickly. Caldwell and Weiss went right together, talking quietly. Caldwell's hand briefly on Weiss's shoulder in the way that senior soldiers touch junior ones when they're trying to pass something forward without making it a formal lesson. Ortega went straight toward the admin section, unhurried. Maddox didn't come out. She waited 40 seconds after the last soldier had cleared the corridor. Then she went back through the briefing room door. He was sitting in the front row chair where he'd been during the colonel's address, forearms on his knees, looking at the floor. He heard her come in and didn't look up immediately. She walked to the second row, one seat to his right, and sat down. She didn't say anything. She simply sat there and let the silence be what it was. After a moment, he looked up. "You could have told me," he said. She met his eyes. "Yes. Before the exercise. You could have said who you were, what you'd built. I would have..." He stopped. "You would have treated me differently," she said, "and the data would have been useless." "I know that's what the colonel said." He exhaled slowly. "I'm asking about you, not the data." She considered this carefully. It was a real question, and it deserved a real answer. "I've been walking into rooms for 8 years, she said, "and introducing myself to the people in them before they've had a chance to form an impression. Telling them my credentials before they can decide they don't matter. And what I've learned is that it doesn't work the way you'd want it to. When you tell someone who you are before they've seen who you are, they hear the words, and then they check the words against what they see. And if what they see doesn't match their expectation, the words lose." She paused. "What happened in this room this morning that was the other version? You saw first. The words came after. And the words landed differently." He sat with that. "That's a harder way to do it," he said. "Yes," she said, "but it's the only way that actually works." He looked at his hands for a moment. "I sent 9 people at you." "I know." "That wasn't a standard exercise configuration. That was me being..." He stopped again, searching for the right word and not finding a flattering one. "Certain," she said simply. He looked at her. "Is that the diplomatic version?" "It's the accurate version," she said. "You were certain, and certainty is useful when it's earned, and dangerous when it isn't. You weren't wrong to be confident in your unit. You were wrong about what confidence required in that specific situation." He was quiet. Then, "The 9 of them. Are their records going to reflect this?" And there it was, the first thing he'd said that was entirely about someone other than himself. She had been waiting for it without knowing she was waiting for it. "The exercise data goes into the simulation improvement database," she said. "It won't be flagged as a performance failure for individual operators. The evaluation was systemic, not individual." Something in his posture released slightly. "They're good soldiers," he said. "All 9 of them. What happened today was my decision, not theirs." "I know that," she said. "And for what it's worth, your Bravo team's consolidation play was the right tactical read. Caldwell made a correct decision with the information he had. He just didn't have the right information." Maddox almost smiled. It didn't complete itself, but it moved in that direction. "He went through the wall," he said. Then he caught himself. "You went through the wall." "The course didn't prohibit it. I know it didn't." He shook his head slowly. "I helped design the course parameters 3 years ago. I know exactly what they prohibit and what they don't. which means I left that door open myself. She looked at him steadily. That's the point of the evaluation system. To find the doors people leave open, including the ones they built themselves. He sat back in the chair. For a moment, he looked exactly like what he was, a man in his early 40s, who had spent 2 decades being certain, finding himself in the particular exhaustion of revision. What happens now? He said. I have 6 weeks of data collection left in this facility, Elena said. I'll be running observation protocols on the simulation system, testing behavioral variance in the operator response models, and producing a performance analysis for the combat simulation development program. She paused. That's the work part. And the other part? She stood up. The other part, she said, is whatever you decide to do with this morning. She picked up her equipment case from the floor beside the chair. I'll be in the systems room from 1300 onward, she said. If you have questions about the evaluation data, that's where I'll be. She walked out, and Maddox sat in the empty briefing room and understood with a clarity that was almost physical that the most significant conversation of the morning had just happened quietly between 2 people with no audience and no record, and he was going to be thinking about it for a very long time. The systems room at Fort Carson's underground facility was a repurposed data center on the facility's 3rd level, a room full of server racks and monitoring terminals that most operational rangers never entered because it was the operational backbone of the simulation system and not a space that required human traffic to function. Elena had been inside it for 11 minutes when the door opened and Sergeant First Class Caldwell came in. He was not alone. Weiss was behind him, and behind Weiss was a younger ranger named Torres, who Elena recognized from the course he had been the 6th operator. She'd neutralized the one in the stairwell, and behind Torres was Hicks, who was apparently operating on the theory that the conversation in the equipment room had opened a door worth walking through. She looked at them. I didn't invite anyone in here, she said. Not hostile. Simply accurate. No, ma'am, Caldwell said. I knocked and nobody answered, so we came in. I apologize for that. We can leave. He said it without flinching, which she respected. You can stay, she said. What do you need? Caldwell looked at the server racks around them, and then back at her. We want to understand what we did wrong, he said. Not what the exercise result says we did wrong. What we actually did wrong. Because the debrief from a colonel's address tells you what happened, but it doesn't tell you how to think differently. And I'd rather hear that from you directly than figure it out wrong on my own. She looked at him for a moment, then she sat back down in her chair. Pull something to sit on, she said. They did pulling equipment boxes and folding chairs from around the room with the organized efficiency of people who have learned to make do with whatever space offers. Within 90 seconds, they were seated in a rough semicircle around her terminal, and she looked at each of them in turn before she spoke. I'm going to tell you something that's not in any training manual, she said, and I'm telling it to you because Caldwell asked the right question, which is the only reason I'm answering it. The right question is not what did we do wrong. The right question is what did we assume that turned out to be untrue. Those feel like the same question and they're not. She let that land. When Master Sergeant Maddox put 9 operators in the course against me, she said he had already made the fundamental decision that determined the result. Not the decision to use 9 people, the decision that came before that. He decided who I was before he had any information about who I was. He built a model of me based on what I looked like walking through the door, and then he ran the exercise against that model. He was not preparing for me. He was preparing for his idea of me. Torres leaned forward slightly, and the idea was wrong. The idea was incomplete, she said. Wrong implies he was being irrational. He wasn't. He was doing what humans do. He was using available data to form a prediction. The available data was limited. The prediction reflected the limitation. She paused. But here's where it became a tactical error rather than just a cognitive one. He acted on the incomplete model with complete confidence. He didn't leave room for variance. He set the exercise up as if the result was already determined. Weiss said quietly, "And that's when you had him." "That's when the result was determined," she said. "Yes, but not by me, by him. I didn't defeat 9 Rangers this morning. 9 Rangers were defeated by the gap between their model and reality. I just moved through that gap. A silence. Hicks said, "How do you build a better model?" She looked at him. "You start by not trusting the first one you form. You form it, you can't stop yourself. It's how cognition works, but you hold it loosely. You treat it as a hypothesis instead of a conclusion. You look for information that contradicts it, not just information that confirms it. And then, when something in the environment doesn't match the model, you update the model instead of ignoring the something," Caldwell said. "Yes," she said. "Exactly." Caldwell nodded slowly. He was processing it with the specific intensity of someone who is not learning a concept for the first time, but is hearing it articulated in a way that makes it suddenly actionable. "The stairwell," Torres said. "That was me right 6th position." "Yes. I was under the false panel. I thought that was completely concealed." "It was completely concealed visually," she said. "The floor shifted under my weight, not dramatically a fraction of an inch. But I was already treating the floor as variable rather than fixed, because the facility's maintenance records show that the false panels in that section are 6 years old, and the compression tolerance has degraded." She paused. "I didn't see you. I felt the floor telling me you were there." Torres sat with this for a moment. "You checked the maintenance records," he said. "At 0430. He exhaled. "Ma'am," he said. "With respect, that is a level of preparation that I don't think any of us considered possible for a single exercise." "It's not about the exercise," she said. "It's about every space I enter. I don't prepare differently for exercises than I prepare for anything else. There's one level of preparation, and it's complete, because I made a decision a long time ago that incomplete preparation is how people die, and I wasn't going to be responsible for that." The room was very quiet. She had said it plainly without drama, and the plainness was what made it land with the weight it did. She was not performing seriousness. She was simply serious. "Can I ask about something else?" Weiss said. "Yes. The mission 3 years ago." He said it carefully, aware he was approaching something that hadn't been publicly disclosed. "The colonel said you have a classified record. 2 situations where the standard answer was, 'It can't be done.' He didn't say more than that." Weiss paused. "I'm not asking for classified information. I'm asking, what does it feel like to be in that situation? Where the standard answer is no, and you're the one who has to find the other answer." She looked at him for a long moment. She didn't answer immediately, and the silence was a specific kind, the silence of someone deciding how honest to be. The Rangers in the room recognized it because they'd been in that silence themselves. "It feels like being very cold and very focused at the same time," she said finally. "Not calm exactly. Calm is the wrong word because calm implies ease. It's more like clarity. Everything narrows. Everything that isn't the immediate problem stops existing. The fear is there, but it's not in front of you. It's somewhere behind you, and you understand that if you turn around to look at it, you'll lose the clarity so you don't turn around." She paused. "You just keep moving toward the problem, and you trust that the preparation you did before you walked in, the preparation that happened in the hours and the months and the years, before this specific moment, you trust that it's there. You trust that you built something you can stand on, even when you can't see it." Nobody spoke. Then Caldwell said quietly, "That's what training is for." "That's exactly what training is for," she said. "Not so you can perform under normal conditions, so you can function when everything normal is gone." The door opened. Everyone turned. Maddox stood in the doorway. He looked at the group assembled around Elena's Terminal 4 Rangers, sitting on equipment boxes and folding chairs in a data center they had no operational reason to be in, and he looked at Elena, and then he looked at the floor briefly, and then back up. "Sergeant Caldwell," he said. "Sergeant," Caldwell said. His voice was level, not defensive, just level. "I'm going to need this room for a systems access review in about 20 minutes, Maddox said. He said it to the group, not to any individual. "Whenever you're done in here." A pause. "We're done," Caldwell said. He looked at Elena. "Thank you, Captain." "Yes," she said. They stood up, returned the equipment boxes and chairs to their original positions with the same efficient competence with which they'd moved them, and filed out past Maddox. Each of them acknowledged him as they passed, not with the particular care of people managing a difficult superior, but with the straightforward acknowledgement of soldiers who have been in the same building all morning and are all in their different ways still processing it. Hicks was last. He stopped next to Maddox in the doorway. "Sergeant," he said. "Hicks. I said something this morning that I shouldn't have said." He looked at Maddox directly. "I think you know what I mean." Maddox looked at him for a moment. "I heard it," he said. "Yes, Sergeant." Hicks held his gaze. "I'm going to do better." Maddox said nothing for a moment. Then, "That's all I've ever asked." Hicks nodded and went through the door. Maddox came fully into the room and let the door close behind him. He looked at the server racks for a moment, and then at Elena, who had turned back to her terminal and resumed whatever she had been doing before the Rangers arrived. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "Do what?" "Talk to them. Explain the thinking. You could have filed your report and let the colonel handle the rest. You didn't have to give them anything." She kept her eyes on the terminal. "I gave them a conversation," she said. "It cost me 40 minutes. They asked the right questions. That's the transaction. They needed it." "Everyone in this building needed something different this morning," she said. Caldwell needed to understand the reasoning. Hicks needed to understand the impact. Weiss needed to hear someone say the thing about training out loud. She turned from the terminal and looked at Maddox properly. "What do you need?" He was quiet for a moment. He pulled a folding chair from the rack beside the door and sat down, not close, not distant, but at a working distance, the way people sit when they intend to have an actual conversation. "I need to understand the simulation system," he said. "Not as an instructor, not as someone who runs the course. I need to understand it the way you understand it, because I've been running Rangers through a system I only partially understood, and I need to know what I've been missing." She looked at him for a moment. She had not expected this. She had expected defensiveness, or managed professionalism, or the particular polite distance that people adopt when they've been embarrassed and are trying to recover their footing without acknowledging the ground has shifted. She had not expected this direct, specific, and genuinely humble in the way that only people who are used to being competent can be humble because they know the difference between understanding and pretending. "That's a 6-week process," she said. "I have 6 weeks," he said. "It involves reviewing material you're going to find uncomfortable," she said. "Because some of what the simulation system reveals about standard Ranger training patterns are biases that the program has been reinforcing for years, including in your unit." "I know," he said. "That's why I need to understand it." She held his gaze for a long moment. "All right," she said. She turned back to the terminal and pulled up the simulation architecture overview, the root-level framework document that almost nobody outside the development program had ever read in its entirety, because it was dense and technical and required a specific kind of patience to move through. "This is the decision architecture baseline," she said. "Everything the simulation generates, every scenario, every operator response model, every escalation sequence comes from this framework." She paused. "Do you want me to walk you through it, or do you want to start reading and ask questions?" "Walk me through it," he said. "I'll read after." She nodded and began. For the next 2 hours, she talked and he listened, and occasionally he asked a question that was more perceptive than she expected, and once he said something that stopped her mid-sentence because it identified a gap in the framework that she had been trying to articulate for 6 months and hadn't found the language for yet. She made a note of it on the terminal without comment, and he didn't ask what the note was, which was also the right instinct. She discovered, a very good student. That shouldn't have surprised her. Everything in his record said it. But the record was numbers and formal assessments, and what she was seeing in this room was the thing that numbers and assessments never quite captured: a person operating at the edge of what they knew. Uncomfortable there, but not retreating, moving through the discomfort toward the thing on the other side of it. That was the quality she had spent her career trying to develop in training systems. That was the quality the simulation models were designed to reward. And here it was in the person she had expected, at least, from 2 hours after the worst morning of his professional life. At 15:47, Colonel Reeves appeared in the doorway. He looked at Maddox, then at Elena, then at the terminal display, and his expression didn't change. But something in it shifted, a slight recalibration, the way a person's face changes when they see something they didn't expect, and the unexpectedness is good. "Captain Cross," he said, "I need your preliminary observations for the program office report, whenever you have a moment." "Yes, sir," she said. "Give me 15 minutes." Reeves looked at Maddox. "Sergeant." "Colonel," Maddox said. Reeves left. Maddox stood up from the folding chair and straightened his vest. He looked at the terminal one more time, at the framework document still open on the screen, with its dense architecture of decision nodes and behavioral variance models, and then at Elena. "Tomorrow," he said. "Can we continue tomorrow?" She considered. 700, she said. "Here." He nodded. "I'll be here at 6:50, he said. She almost said something about that. She didn't, because what she would have said was that arriving early was the right instinct, and she didn't want to confirm it with a compliment because confirmation before consistency was just encouragement, and encouragement before evidence was just noise. Instead, she said, "Bring questions." "I already have 12, he said, and he walked out of the room. She sat for a moment after the door closed and felt the day settling around her the way long days settle when they have been genuinely difficult and genuinely productive in equal measure. She had not come to Fort Carson to make an enemy into an ally. That was not in the evaluation parameters. That was not what the program office had sent her here to do. But she also had known, since the early years of this work, since the first time she had walked into a room where nobody expected anything from her and had left it having changed something that couldn't be unchanged, that the work was never only what the parameters described. The parameters described the minimum. The work was everything you could reach for beyond that. She turned back to the terminal, opened a new document, and began writing her preliminary observations. The first line read, "Behavioral variance in the current operator response model significantly underestimates adaptive capacity in non-standard personnel." She paused. Then she added, "Recommend immediate review of assumption architecture in assessment protocols." She saved the document. Outside the systems room, the facility was moving into late afternoon. The sounds of it changing registered the morning's sharpness, giving way to something more settled. People were still talking about what had happened. She could feel it in the quality of the building without hearing any specific conversation. The kind of collective processing that happens in a place after something significant has disrupted the ordinary pattern. She was used to being the disruption. She was never quite used to what came after. She set her hands on the keyboard and kept writing. Because the report was due in 6 days and the work was not finished, and she had never in her professional life let an unfinished report wait on the state of her feelings. That was not discipline. That was simply who she was. Maddox arrived at 0648. Elena was already there. She had been there since 0610, which she did not mention because it was not relevant information for anyone except herself. What was relevant was the document open on the terminal, a 70-page behavioral analysis of the Fort Carson unit's simulation performance over the previous 18 months, which she had spent the better part of the previous evening reading with the specific attention of someone looking not for what the data said, but for what the data was avoiding saying. She heard him come through the door and didn't look up. "You said you had 12 questions, she said. He pulled the same folding chair from the rack beside the door, the same one he had used the afternoon before, she noticed, as if he had already claimed it by use, and sat down and pulled out a small notepad. Paper, not a tablet. She glanced at it. "You write by hand," she said. "I think better when I write by hand," he said. "Always have." He opened to a page that already had handwriting on it. Question 1. The decision architecture baseline you showed me yesterday, the root framework. There are 11 behavioral bias categories listed in the standard operator response model. Only 3 of them are flagged as high priority for simulation training. I want to know who chose those 3 and what criteria they used, because from what I read last night, 2 of the 8 unflagged categories look more operationally significant than one of the flagged ones. She stopped typing. She turned and looked at him. "You read the full baseline document last night?" she said. "You said to bring questions." He met her eyes. "I needed questions, so I read." The baseline document was 93 pages. It was not written for easy reading. It was written for technical reference, dense with systems language and behavioral modeling notation. She had watched senior program analysts struggle through it in formal briefing settings with the document projected in front of them. He had read it alone on paper, presumably in one evening, and had come back with a question that identified a real gap in the priority framework that the program office had been debating internally for 2 years. She turned fully in her chair to face him. The 3 flagged categories were chosen by a committee in 2021, she said. The criteria were frequency of occurrence in training scenarios and correlation with after-action report findings. The problem with those criteria is that they're backward-looking. They identify what went wrong in past exercises. They don't identify what might go wrong in conditions the training system hasn't yet generated. She paused. The 2 categories you noticed, threat source misidentification and position assumption error. Those are underweighted precisely because they tend to fail silently. They don't produce dramatic after-action report entries. They produce small recurring errors that only become visible when you aggregate the data across a long time window. He wrote something on the notepad. How long a time window, he said. 18 months minimum, she said, which is how long I've been reviewing this facility's performance record. He looked up from the notepad. And what does 18 months of data say about this unit, he said. It was a direct question, and he asked it with the directness of someone who has decided they want the truth more than they want to feel good. She held his gaze. Your unit is technically excellent, she said. Speed metrics, physical performance, weapons accuracy, all above standard. The simulation performance scores are strong by every conventional measure. She paused. The aggregate data also shows a consistent pattern of position assumption error in scenarios involving non-standard operators. When the simulation generates an opponent profile that doesn't match the standard threat model, different movement pattern, different decision timing, different physical profile, your operators adjust more slowly than the baseline predicts they should, given their overall skill level. The gap between their capability and their adaptation rate is the telling thing. They can do more than they do. The lag is not a skill problem, it's a model problem. Gil, he set the notepad down. They see what they expect, he said. They see what they train to see, she said. Which is what they were taught to see, which means it's not a failure of individual soldiers, it's a failure of the training design. She paused. Which means it's partially my problem because I helped build the training design. He looked at her for a moment. You're including yourself in this. I include myself in everything that happens in systems I built, she said. That's the only honest way to evaluate them. He picked up the notepad again. Question 2, he said. And the morning moved forward. They worked through his 12 questions in 2 hours and 11 minutes. 3 of them produced answers that were straightforward. 4 of them produced conversations that ran significantly longer than either person planned, the kind where a question turns into a doorway, and through the doorway is another room, and in that room is something neither person has fully articulated before. The remaining 5 questions he had written became 23 by the time they reached the end, because that was what happened when someone started reading a technical system. With genuine attention, the document didn't close, it opened. At 09:30, Ortega knocked and came in. He looked at the 2 of them. Elena at the terminal, Maddox on the folding chair with his notepad, and processed what he was seeing with the quick private recalibration of a person who knew both individuals well and was updating his model of both simultaneously. Sergeant Maddox, he said. Colonel Reeves wants you in the tactical planning room at 1000. Quarterly assessment prep. Copy that. Maddox stood and picked up the notepad. He looked at Elena. This afternoon. I have program office calls from 1300 to 1500, she said. After 1500? 15:15, he said. She nodded. Maddox moved toward the door. He stopped next to Ortega. You should sit in on these sessions, he said to Ortega. What she's showing me about the behavioral architecture, it's going to change how we're running the assessment program. Ortega looked at Elena, then back at Maddox. Yeah, he said. Yes, Maddox said simply, and went through the door. Ortega stood in the room for a moment, looking at Elena with an expression that was somewhere between reassessment and something warmer. "He came in at 0648, she said before he could say anything. "I know," Ortega said. "I saw him in the parking area." He paused. "He was here before 0650. "He said he'd be here at 0650. Ortega was quiet for a moment. "I've known Cole Maddox for 7 years," he said. "I've never seen him sit in a room and take notes by hand." "He thinks better by hand," she said. Ortega laughed, a short, genuine sound that surprised him slightly. "Yeah," he said. "He does. He just hasn't done it in a long time." He looked at her. "Whatever you're doing in here, Captain, keep doing it." He left. Elena turned back to the terminal. She opened the preliminary observations document and added 2 lines to the section on behavioral adaptation. The addition was small. The implications were not. She saved the document and moved to the next section. In the hallway outside, she could hear the facility coming fully awake around her, voices movement, the ordinary sounds of a training day beginning. She had been inside this building for just under 24 hours, and it already felt different from when she had arrived. Not transformed, not fixed, but different in the specific way that places feel different when something real has happened in them. She filed this impression and kept working. The program office call at 1300 went 40 minutes long, which was not unusual. The program director, a civilian analyst named Dr. Patricia Howe, who had been running the Combat Simulation Development Program for 9 years, and had the particular energy of someone who operated at full capacity all the time and expected everyone around her to do the same, had questions about the preliminary observations that required detailed answers. "The assumption architecture finding," Howe said through the earpiece. "You're recommending immediate review. Define immediate." 60 days, Elena said. "The current model has 18 months of variance data behind it that points consistently in the same direction. We've been building training scenarios against a standard threat model that doesn't reflect the full range of operational conditions that units are likely to encounter. Every day we run the current model is another day of reinforcing the gap." "The committee review cycle is quarterly," Howe said. "The committee review cycle needs to be accelerated," Elena said. "The Fort Carson data isn't an outlier. I've been comparing it against the performance records from Bragg and Lewis McChord. The pattern is consistent across all 3 facilities. This is not a unit problem. It's a program problem." A pause. "You have confirmation from Bragg and Lewis McChord," Howe said. "I have the performance data. The confirmation is in the aggregate." She pulled up the comparative analysis on her terminal. "I can send you the file in the next 30 minutes. "Send it," Howe said. And Elena, the political situation around the assumption architecture review is more complex than the technical situation. There are people on the committee who built the current model and are going to resist the finding. "I'm aware," Elena said. "The finding is still correct." Howe made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "Yes," she said. "It is? Send me the file." The call ended. Elena sent the file and went back to the observations document and wrote for 40 minutes without stopping, the way she wrote when something had clarified in her head and needed to get out before the clarity faded. She wrote about the behavioral gap she had identified. She wrote about the position assumption error pattern. She wrote about the specific quality of what she had seen in the Fort Carson unit. Not bad soldiers, not failing soldiers, but excellent soldiers operating against a model that was quietly limiting what they could see. She wrote one paragraph that she read back twice before leaving in the document because it said something she had been building toward for 2 years and had not previously said plainly. The most dangerous limitation in any training system is not what it fails to teach. It is what it teaches people not to see. She read it a 3rd time, left it, saved the document. At 14:48, Hicks knocked on the open door. She looked up. He was standing in the doorway with his helmet in his hands and an expression that she was beginning to recognize as his version of approaching something carefully. A particular set to his jaw. A directness in his eyes that was doing work to suppress the younger, less certain version of himself that still lived just behind it. "You have 15 minutes, she said. Not a question. T. "Yes, ma'am." He came in. Didn't sit down. Stood at a distance that was respectful without being theatrical. "I wanted to tell you something." "Go ahead." "I talked to Caldwell last night. after the session in here. We talked for about 2 hours. He paused. He told me about a situation in his second deployment where he made a call based on an assumption that turned out to be wrong. Not catastrophically wrong, nobody died, but wrong enough that the outcome was different than it should have been, and he's been carrying it since. He paused again. He said he never understood exactly where the assumption came from until yesterday. When you explained the model problem versus the skill problem, she said nothing. Let him continue. I've been thinking about my own record since yesterday, he said. Not the scores, not the performance metrics, the actual decisions I've made and why I made them. And I keep finding the same thing. I made the decision I was trained to expect myself to make. I didn't make the decision the situation actually called for. I made the decision that matched the model I was given. He stopped. That's not an excuse for this morning. I want to be clear about that. What I said when you walked in, that wasn't the model. That was me. But the bigger pattern, I think the model is part of it. She looked at him. You're right, she said. On all of it. He absorbed this. What do I do with that? He said. You do what Caldwell is doing, she said. You go back through your record with the new framework and you rebuild your understanding of your own decision history. It's uncomfortable. It takes time. And when you're done, you'll be a better operator, and you'll also be somewhat more uncertain about some things than you were before, which is not a problem. It's the point. More uncertain is better, he said. Not sarcastically. Genuinely. Calibrated uncertainty is always better than miscalibrated confidence. She said. Yes. He nodded slowly. The thing Caldwell said, he added, about what you told them in the stairwell position session, about the night overseas. He didn't tell me details, I don't think he knew details, but he told me the way you described staying focused. He paused. I've been in one situation close to that. One time where the standard answer was it can't be done. I didn't find the other answer. I waited for someone else to find it. He looked at her directly. I don't want to be that person the next time. She held his gaze for a long moment. Then you need to trust your preparation more than you trust your comfort, she said. The next time you're in that situation, and you will be, the comfort is going to tell you to wait. The preparation is going to tell you to move. You have to decide which one you believe. That decision is made before the situation, not during it. It's made in rooms like this one. It's made right now. He stood very still. Yes, ma'am, he said, and this time, the phrase had a different weight behind it than it had carried any other time he'd said it. He left at 14:58. She looked at the door for a moment after it closed. Then she pulled up the behavioral architecture document and added 3 lines to the section on individual operator development pathways, because Hicks had said something in the last 5 minutes that she was going to need to account for in the program recommendation. The finding was expanding. That happened sometimes. You came in with a defined scope and the work opened it. She didn't resist this. She followed where the data led. Maddox came back at 15:15 exactly. He had the notepad. He had a second notepad. Now she noticed the first one nearly full, a new one underneath it, both of them held together with a rubber band that he removed efficiently and put in his vest pocket before sitting down. He had been in a quarterly assessment prep meeting for 3.5 hours. He had the specific look of someone who has been in a meeting for 3.5 hours and has spent a significant portion of it thinking about something other than the meeting. The quarterly assessment, he said before she could speak. The metrics we use to evaluate operator performance. The scoring framework. He put the notepad on his knee. How much of that framework comes from the simulation decision architecture? She felt something sharpen in her attention. About 60%, she said carefully. The physical performance metrics are independent. The decision-making and adaptive response metrics are drawn from the simulation model, which means, he said, that if the simulation model has a bias problem in the assumption architecture, then the quarterly assessment scores are reflecting that bias back as performance data, she said. Yes. He looked at her. We've been scoring people highly for doing exactly what the biased model rewards, he said, and people who naturally operate differently from the model more adaptively, less by the standard pattern they've been scoring lower. In some cases, she said. Yes, Not universally, but the pattern is present in the data. Which means we might have been telling excellent operators that they're average, he said, and average operators that they're excellent. He said it plainly without heat, which made it land harder than anger would have. That's the implication, she said. It's one of the reasons I recommended immediate review. He sat back. He looked at the ceiling for a moment, then at the wall, then at the notepad on his knee. He was doing something internal. She could see the shape of it without seeing the content. He was running back through people, specific people, rangers he had evaluated, instructors he had assessed, decisions he had made about who was ready for what. He was running them against a new framework and finding discrepancies, and the discrepancies were costing him something. I have 2 names, he said finally. She waited. 2 rangers in this unit who have consistently scored below the standard threshold on adaptive response metrics. Both of them are exceptional in field exercises. Both of them make decisions that I've always thought were too unconventional for the metric, but right for the situation. I've been arguing with the scoring system about both of them for 2 years. He paused. The scoring system has been winning. Tell me their names, she said. I'll pull their performance records, he told her. She pulled them up on the terminal. She reviewed them for 4 minutes in silence while he sat and waited, which he did with the particular patience of someone who has learned that rushing this kind of review is how you miss what matters. She read. Then she sat back in her chair. These 2 people, she said slowly, should be the highest adaptive response scorers in this unit. He exhaled. Yes, he said. That's what I thought. The model has been penalizing exactly the behavior pattern that makes them effective, she said. Their decision timing is faster than the standard model predicts for their experience level. The model reads that as impulsivity. In practice, it's pattern recognition operating at a higher speed than the metric was calibrated to account for. What can we do? He said. I'm going to flag both records in the program analysis, she said, formally, with data. And I'm going to include their profiles as case studies in the assumption architecture review recommendation. Their records are the clearest evidence I've found in this facility of the gap between what the model rewards and what actual operational effectiveness looks like. He nodded. Then he said, will that help them now? Or is this something that gets fixed in the next version of the system and they're already gone? She looked at him. Both of them are currently serving in this unit. Yes. Then it helps them now, she said. Program Office can issue interim scoring adjustments pending the full review. It's not a common pathway, but it exists. I'll request it. He said nothing for a moment. Then, thank you. She turned back to the terminal and began drafting the flag language. She was 3 sentences in when she stopped. She had found something else in the second ranger's record. Something that sat slightly outside the performance metrics and the simulation scores, a note in the file logged by a previous unit instructor that described the ranger's performance during a training scenario involving a female evaluator from an outside program. The note described the ranger as having shown appropriate operational deference to the evaluator's guidance. It was a small note, neutral in language, but it was in the file, which meant someone had thought it was worth documenting that a male ranger had not given a female evaluator a difficult time. She read it twice. She did not say anything about it out loud. She filed it in the part of herself where she kept the things that were true and necessary to know, and not yet the right time to address, and she kept writing the flag language because the flag language was what the ranger needed right now, and the note in the file was a problem for the system, and the system problem was already in the document, and that was enough for one day. But she remembered it. She always remembered. At 18:30, the facility was winding down. The last training cycle of the day had finished 40 minutes earlier. The monitoring staff had logged out. The rangers had cleared the main floor. The building had settled into the particular quiet of a place where the working day was done, but the building itself remained holding everything that had happened in it. Elena was still at the terminal when Colonel Reeves appeared in the doorway. He looked at her and then at the room. You've been in here for 11 hours, he said. Approximately, she said without looking up. Have you eaten today? A pause. I had something this morning. He made a sound that was not quite a sigh and not quite a comment. Captain Cross. He came into the room and stood beside the terminal. I want to tell you something that is not going in any report. She looked up. He looked at her with the expression of a man who has seen a great many things in 38 years of service and has learned which of them matter and which of them are noise. What you did this morning, not the exercise. What you did after. The conversation with Maddox. The sessions with the Rangers. He paused. That kind of work doesn't have a metric. The program office can't measure it. It won't appear in the quarterly report, or the simulation improvement database, or the assumption architecture review. He paused again. But it happened, and in my experience, the things that happen without metrics are usually the things that actually change something. She held his gaze. Is that your way of telling me to eat something, sir? His expression moved toward something that was almost a smile. It's my way of telling you that I've been in this army for 38 years, he said, and I've watched a lot of evaluators come through a lot of facilities. Most of them write good reports. Some of them run good sessions. Very few of them walk into a room of 9 Rangers and then spend the rest of the day making sure every person in that building comes away from the experience better than they were at the start of it. He looked at her steadily. That's a rare thing. I wanted you to know that I see it. She was quiet for a moment. Not because she didn't have a response. Because the response she had was one of the honest ones, the kind she didn't always give, and she was deciding whether this was the right room for it. I came here to evaluate a simulation system, she said finally. I didn't come here to fix anything. I know, he said, but you can't build a system that works, she continued, and then leave it in the hands of people who don't understand why it works. The system is only as good as the people running it. If the people running it have gaps, the system has gaps, and the people the system is supposed to prepare for the field have gaps, and at some point, someone in a field situation is relying on preparation that was built on a foundation that has gaps in it. She paused. I can't write a good technical report and then walk away from that chain. I can't be that separated from the consequence. Reeves looked at her for a long moment. No, he said quietly. I don't suppose you can. He straightened. Go eat something, he said. The report will still be here tomorrow. He left. She sat for a moment after he was gone, and the building was very quiet, and she looked at the terminal with its open documents, and its flagged records, and its pages of observations and recommendations, and she thought about the day from its beginning, the south door opening at 7:58, and the room getting quieter as she walked through it. And she thought about all the rooms before this one that had gotten quieter in the same way, and all the rooms ahead that would do the same thing. She saved her work. She closed the terminal. She stood up, picked up her equipment case, and walked out of the systems room. And in the corridor outside, she passed the door to the main training floor, and she stopped for just a moment, and looked through the small reinforced window at the empty space inside the course layout. The monitoring positions, the floor where 9 Rangers had stood that morning, already certain of what they were about to see. She looked for 3 seconds. Then she kept walking. Because the day was done, and tomorrow was already full, and there was more work ahead than behind. There always was. She ate at the facility's small staff kitchen on the ground level, a protein bar and black coffee, standing at the counter, reading the preliminary observations document on her phone, with one hand, and eating with the other. Because Colonel Reeves had told her to eat something, and she had taken the instruction literally, without necessarily taking it in the spirit it was intended. The kitchen was empty except for Ortega, who came in at 18:52 and stopped when he saw her. You're still here, he said. I'm eating, she said, and held up the protein bar as evidence. He looked at it. That's technically true, he said, and poured himself a cup of coffee and leaned against the counter across from her with the relaxed posture of a man who has spent enough years in enough facilities to be comfortable in every room he enters. Long day. Good day, she said. He looked at her. Yeah. The work moved forward, she said. That's what a good day is. He nodded slowly. He drank his coffee, and she finished the protein bar, and neither of them spoke for a moment, and it was the kind of silence that exists between people who don't know each other well, but have been through something together and have found in the aftermath that they're comfortable enough with the same quiet. Can I ask you something? Ortega said. Yes. This morning before the exercise, when Maddox set up the 9 operators. He paused, choosing his words. Did you know what he was doing? What the intent behind it was? She considered. "I knew he was setting something up," she said. "The specific number I didn't know until the exercise started. But the intent, yes, I could see it. And you let it happen." "The evaluation required authentic conditions," she said. "That's the technical answer," Ortega said. He wasn't being confrontational. He was being precise, which she respected. "What's the other one?" She set the empty wrapper on the counter. "I've been in rooms where the intent was the same, and the authority was different," she said. "Where the person setting up the situation had the power to make the consequences real and lasting rather than instructional. I've learned to read the difference. This morning Maddox was wrong and he was arrogant, and what he did was designed to be humiliating. But it was also correctable. He's a person who can be reached." She paused. "Not every room has that. When a room has that, you use the situation instead of avoiding it. You let it become what it can become." Ortega was quiet for a moment. "Most people would have been angry," he said. "I was angry," she said. "I'm also practical." Both things were true at the same time. He looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not reassessment, exactly, something more settled than that. Recognition, maybe. The kind that comes when someone you've been observing all day finally says the thing that completes the picture. "He's going to be different after this," Ortega said. "Maddox, I've known him 7 years. What's happening in that systems room, he's not going to come out of it the same person who went in." "Good," she said simply. "Yeah," Ortega said. "Good." She picked up her phone and her coffee and moved toward the door. "Get some sleep, Captain Cross," he said behind her. "You too, Sergeant," she said, and went into the corridor. She did not sleep well. This was not unusual. She lay in the temporary quarters assigned to visiting personnel and went through the day with the systematic attention she brought to everything, not to torture herself with it, not because she was anxious, but because the day had been genuinely dense with information, and information needed to be processed before it could become knowledge. She went through each conversation in sequence. Maddox in the briefing room, the Rangers in the systems room, Hicks in the doorway, Reeves at the end of the day, Ortega in the kitchen. She examined each of them for what she might have missed, what she might have done differently, what needed to carry forward into the next day. The note in the second Ranger's file came back to her. She had filed it away during the afternoon and let it sit, but now it surfaced with the specific insistence of things that don't want to be left in the dark. A note that documented as a notable event the fact that a male ranger had treated a female evaluator professionally. That was the bar. That was what someone had thought was worth writing down, not excellence, not exceptional performance, not anything that should be remarkable. Simply, he behaved the way a professional should behave toward another professional. She lay still for a moment with this. Then she got up, opened her laptop, and added a new section to the observations document. She titled it internally in her head before she typed it, not with a formal header, because the document didn't use headers, but she knew what the section was. It was the section about the things the data didn't say directly, but that the data implied, if you were willing to follow the implication to where it led. She wrote for 40 minutes. When she finished, she read it back. Once changed 2 words, saved the document, closed the laptop, and slept. The next morning, Maddox came in at 06:45. She was already there. She did not mention it. He did not mention it. He sat in the folding chair and opened the notepad, and she opened the terminal, and they went to work the way people go to work when they have established a rhythm without ceremony, without negotiation, simply by beginning. 3 days passed this way. The pattern held mornings in the systems room, afternoons, split between her program office work and the sessions that various Rangers found reasons to attend evenings in the data. The unit adapted to her presence with the specific speed of a group of people who have had their assumptions comprehensively disrupted and have decided collectively to move through the disruption rather than around it. By the 3rd day, soldiers she had never spoken to were leaving questions written on paper slips outside the systems room door, which she found when she arrived each morning, and answered in sequence, which produced more questions, which she also answered. Ortega started a log of the questions and answers. She discovered this on the 4th day and said nothing about it because it was exactly the right thing to do, and she didn't want to make it self-conscious by acknowledging it. On the 5th day, something changed. She felt it before she understood it, a shift in the quality of the morning. The kind of atmospheric change that registers before you can name the cause. She came into the systems room at 0610, and something was different in the building. Not wrong, different. Maddox came in at 0643, 7 minutes earlier than yesterday. He sat down and opened the notepad, but he didn't look at it immediately. He looked at her. "There's a meeting this afternoon," he said. 1400. "The colonel wants you there." "I know," she said. "He told me yesterday." "It's not just a program review meeting," Maddox said. "There are going to be people there from outside this facility." She stopped typing. "Who?" she said. "Two people from the Ranger Training Brigade. One from Army Human Resources Command." He paused. "And a senior officer from the Combat Simulation Development Program's Oversight Committee. Someone above Dr. Howe." She was very still for a moment. "What's the meeting about?" she said. Not because she didn't have a guess, because she wanted to hear it said. "I think it's about your preliminary observations report," he said. "Specifically the Assumption Architecture section, and the performance flag you submitted for the two Rangers." He paused. "I think someone on the Oversight Committee has a problem with the findings." She looked at him directly. "How do you know this?" "Because Colonel Reeves told me this morning when I passed him in the corridor," he said. "He wanted me to give you time to prepare." He held her gaze. "He also told me that the senior officer coming this afternoon has oversight authority over the program review process, which means he has authority over your evaluation parameters." She sat back in her chair. "His name," she said. "Brigadier General Marcus Holt." She knew the name. She knew the record. She also knew that Brigadier General Marcus Holt had been on the original committee that designed the Assumption Architecture Framework in 2021. The very framework that her preliminary observations had identified as systemically biased. He had not simply approved the framework, he had championed it. He had presented it to senior leadership as a significant advancement in simulation training methodology. His professional reputation was, in some meaningful measure, attached to its validity. She understood the shape of the afternoon now. "All right," she said. "All right," Maddox said. "It's a meeting," she said. "I've been in meetings." He looked at her for a moment. "He has oversight authority over your evaluation," he said again carefully, as if she might not have understood the implication. "I heard you," she said. "He also doesn't have authority over the data, and the data is what the observations are built on." She turned back to the terminal. "Let's use the morning well." Maddox looked at her for another moment. Then he opened the notepad. They used the morning well. Cheng. At 13:55. 5 minutes before the meeting was scheduled to begin, Elena went into the women's restroom on the facility's second level and stood at the sink and looked at herself in the mirror for exactly 30 seconds. She had done this before every significant meeting for 8 years. Not to check her appearance, though she checked her appearance, but to do something more specific, to look at the person she was about to walk in as and remind herself who that person was. 8 years, 31 evaluation projects, 11 facilities, 2 classified deployments, 70% of the current simulation decision architecture, 147 pages of technical documentation that had changed how the Army trained its operators, the note in the Rangers file about appropriate professional deference, the 9 operators this morning 6 days ago who had blocked her path and learned something on the other side of it. Maddox with his paper notepad. Hicks in the doorway. Caldwell's hand on Weiss's shoulder in the corridor. All of it was hers. All of it was real. None of it needed defending it, only needed presenting. She looked at herself in the mirror for 30 seconds. Then she dried her hands and walked into the meeting. General Holt was 61 years old and had spent his career understanding that authority was most effective when it was not displayed loudly. He sat at the head of the table in the tactical planning room with the particular stillness of a man who has been the most powerful person in rooms so often that he no longer needed to do anything to signal it. He had 2 aides with him. The Ranger Training Brigade representatives sat on his left. The Human Resources Command officer sat on his right, close to Reeves. Maddox was at the far end of the table. He had not been required to attend. He had asked Reeves to be present. Reeves had said yes. Elena sat across from the HRC officer midway down the table. She had her laptop open and the observations document loaded. She had also, at 09:30 that morning, opened a secondary document that she had been building for 2 months and had not included in the preliminary report because she had wanted to be certain of it before she presented it. She was certain now. General Holt opened the meeting. "Captain Cross," he said, "your preliminary observations have generated significant discussion at the program oversight level. I've asked for this meeting to address specific findings before they advance to the formal review stage." He paused. "I want to be direct with you. The assumption architecture framework that your report critiques is the foundation of the current simulation training model. It has been in use for 5 years across 14 facilities. The performance data for those 5 years shows consistent improvement in evaluated operator metrics across the board." "Yes, sir," she said. "I've reviewed that performance data. It shows improvement against the metrics the framework was designed to produce. That's an important distinction." A beat of silence. "Explain that distinction, Captain," he said. "The framework defines what we measure," she said. "If we measure what the framework rewards, and we see improvement in those measurements, we've confirmed that operators are getting better at what we're training them for. We have not confirmed that what we're training them for is the right thing." She paused. "The assumption architecture rewards a specific pattern of threat identification and response. Operators trained against it have gotten very good at that pattern. The gap in the data, the gap that 18 months of variance analysis at 3 facilities reveals, is what happens when the operational condition falls outside that pattern. In those conditions, performance doesn't just fail to improve, it degrades. Because the training has created a confident, consistent response to a category of situation, and that confidence transfers into situations where the response doesn't apply." The room was quiet. One of the Ranger Training Brigade representatives, a colonel named Whitmore, who had been looking at Elena with the careful attention of someone who arrived skeptical and is finding the situation more complicated than expected, leaned forward slightly. "You're saying the training makes people worse in non-standard conditions," he said. "Not aggressive, genuinely working through it. I'm saying the training creates a model dependency that reduces adaptive response in non-standard conditions relative to baseline capability," she said. "The operators are not worse than they would have been without training. They're less adaptive than their raw capability would predict. The training narrows the response pattern when it should be expanding it." General Holt said, "You have data for this claim." "Yes, sir." She turned the laptop to face him and pushed it down the table. 3 facilities, 18 months. The variance analysis is in the 3rd section. The case studies from this facility are in the Appendix 2 specific operator profiles that illustrate the gap between measured performance under the current framework and actual operational capability as observed in field exercises. He looked at the laptop. He did not pick it up yet. "These case studies," he said, "they come from exercises run here under your direction. They come from performance records compiled over 2 years by Master Sergeant Maddox's assessment unit and cross-referenced with field exercise observations logged by 3 separate instructors over the same period," she said. "My analysis identified the pattern. The underlying data is the unit's own." He looked at Maddox at the end of the table. Maddox met his eyes. "The data is accurate, sir," Maddox said. "Both Rangers referenced are among the most effective field operators in this unit. Their simulation scores don't reflect that. Captain Cross's analysis is correct." A specific kind of quiet fell over the room. The HRC officer wrote something on her notepad. General Holt looked at Elena. "Captain," he said, "you're aware that this finding, if it advances to formal review, will require a comprehensive audit of the assumption architecture framework. That process will take a minimum of 6 months and will affect training programs at 14 facilities." "Yes, sir," she said. "You're also aware that the committee that approved the original framework is going to review your methodology and your data before the audit can begin." "Yes, sir." "And you're comfortable with that scrutiny?" She looked at him steadily. "Sir," she said, "I would be concerned if the scrutiny wasn't thorough. The finding is significant. It should be challenged rigorously. If the data doesn't hold up under rigorous challenge, the finding should be revised. That's how the process is supposed to work." She paused. My confidence in presenting this is not confidence that I'm infallible. It's confidence that the data was collected carefully, the analysis was conducted honestly, and the conclusion follows from the evidence. The committee should test all three of those things. General Holt was quiet. He was looking at her with an expression she couldn't read, which was unusual for her. Most expressions she could read. His was the expression of a man running a calculation she didn't have full visibility into. Then he picked up the laptop. He read for 4 minutes in silence. Nobody in the room spoke. The two aides with Holt sat perfectly still. The Ranger Training Brigade representatives exchanged one brief glance and then looked at the table. Maddox sat at the end of the table with his hands flat on the surface and his eyes on the middle distance, and Elena recognized the quality of his stillness. Now it was the same stillness she had felt in the course on day 1. He was not passive. He was ready. Holt set the laptop down. He looked at Colonel Whitmore from the Ranger Training Brigade. "Colonel," he said, "your assessment." Whitmore looked at the laptop and then at Elena. "If the variance data holds up," he said carefully, "this is a significant finding. We've had conversations at the brigade level about non-standard operator performance in simulation that I think this framework might be explaining." He paused. "I'd want the data reviewed, but I think it needs to be reviewed seriously." Holt looked at the HRC officer. "The performance flag on the two Rangers," he said. "The interim scoring adjustment Captain Cross requested." "It's an unusual pathway," the HRC officer said. "But it exists for exactly this kind of situation. If the preliminary finding is substantiated, and the data here looks substantive, the adjustment is appropriate." Holt set his hands flat on the table. He looked at Elena for a long moment. "Captain Cross," he said, "I designed significant portions of the framework your report is challenging." "Yes, sir," she said. "I know. Then you understand why I'm going to be especially rigorous in reviewing your methodology." "Yes, sir," she said. "I'd expect nothing less." He held her gaze. "I want the full analysis on my desk within 14 days, he said. "Not the preliminary observations, the complete finding. Every data point, every variance calculation, every case study. Full documentation of methodology." He paused. "If the data is as solid as it appears to be, the assumption architecture review will proceed. If it isn't, we'll have a different conversation." "Understood, sir," she said. "One more thing." He looked at her with the particular expression she still couldn't fully read. "The case studies from this facility, the two Rangers whose records you flagged. You identified this pattern after being in this building for less than a week." "Yes, sir." "How?" It was one word asked simply, and it was the most direct question anyone had asked her in the entire meeting. "Because I came in looking for the gap between what the system rewards and what actual performance looks like," she said. "I came in looking for exactly that, and this unit gave me conditions to look under the exercise this morning, the conversations afterward, the access to the full performance record. When you know what you're looking for, and the conditions allow you to look, the pattern isn't hidden." He was quiet for a moment. "Dismissed," he said to the room generally. People began to move. He said quietly to Elena alone, 14 days, Captain." "Yes, sir," she said. He picked up his folder and left. In the corridor afterward, Maddox fell into step beside her. He said nothing for 10 seconds. She let the silence be what it was. Then, "He's going to let it go forward." "Yes," she said. "Even though it challenges something he built. The data is solid," she said. "He knows it. He's been doing this long enough to know the difference between a finding that threatens his work and a finding that improves it. This is the second kind. It's going to take him some time to get there fully, but he'll get there." Maddox was quiet for another moment. "How do you know that?" he said. "About him." She glanced at him sideways. "Because he asked me how," she said. "Not to challenge me, genuinely. He wanted to know the method. People who are trying to protect a position don't ask how, they ask why you're wrong. He asked how you were right." She paused. "That's the signal." Maddox absorbed this. "You read rooms," he said. "I read people," she said. "Rooms are just where people happen to be." He stopped walking. She stopped beside him. He looked at her with an expression that was complex in the specific way that expressions are complex when someone is trying to say something they haven't fully resolved yet but need to say before it gets any heavier. "I owe you a different morning than the one I gave you last week," he said. She looked at him. "You gave me the morning the work required," she said. "That's generous." "It's accurate," she said. "If you'd treated me differently when I walked in, none of the rest of it happens. The evaluation data is compromised. The conversations with Caldwell and Hicks, and the rest of them, don't happen the way they happened. Holt is in that meeting today without the most important case studies in the analysis." She held his gaze. "I'm not excusing how you thought about me when you saw me walk through the door. That part was wrong, and you know it, and I think you're going to carry it the way it deserves to be carried, not as punishment, but as information." She paused. "What I'm saying is that everything you did after the notepad, the questions, the morning sessions, what you said in that meeting, just now, that's also who you are. And that part is what I'm going to remember." He stood very still. He looked like a man who had been handed something he didn't know how to hold yet, but was going to learn. "All right," he said quietly. "All right," she said, and started walking again. The 14 days were the fullest of her professional year. She worked 17-hour days and ate properly this time because Ortega started leaving food outside the systems room door with a precision that suggested he had thought carefully about both nutrition and timing, which she acknowledged by leaving the empty containers neatly stacked for him to collect, which he did without comment. They developed this system without ever discussing it, which she found in the margins of her attention quietly touching. Maddox came in every morning at 6:43. By the end of the second week, the notepad he'd started on day one was full, and he was halfway through the third. She never asked to read them. He never offered. She understood that the notepads were his, the way the data was hers, the private mechanism of a person processing something significant on their own terms. The two flagged Rangers Staff Sergeant Deirdre Navarro and Corporal James Okafor received their interim scoring adjustments on day 9. Elena was in the systems room when she heard the news come through the unit, not announced formally, but traveling the way everything travels in a tight facility through conversation, through the specific change in the ambient sound of a place when something that was wrong has been corrected. She heard Navarro's reaction secondhand through Weiss, who appeared in the doorway the following morning with a look on his face that he was working to manage. "Navarro asked me to tell you," he said. She said, "Tell her I know." Elena looked at him. "Tell Navarro she earned it," she said. "I just found the record." Weiss nodded. He stood in the doorway for a moment. "Okafor cried," he said, "when he found out. He was alone in the equipment room, and he thought no one saw him, but Torres saw him. He didn't tell anyone except me because I don't know. He thought I should know." He paused. "Okafor has been in this program for 4 years. 4 years of being told the scores don't reflect what he can do, and being told that the scores are what they are." She said nothing. She let him say the rest. "He never stopped," Weiss said. "He kept coming in every day and running the scenarios and getting the same scores, and he never stopped. I don't know how he did that." She looked at Weiss steadily. "Because he knew what he was capable of," she said. "And knowing that, really knowing it not as confidence, but as demonstrated fact, that's harder to take away than people think." Weiss was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That's what you have, isn't it? That's what you walked in with last week." She held his gaze. "Yes," she said. He nodded once and left. The complete analysis reached General Holt's desk on day 14 at 0847. It was 212 pages. The methodology section alone was 41 pages. The variance data spanned 3 facilities, 18 months, and 640 individual operator performance records. The case studies section included Navarro and Okafor, and 4 additional profiles from the Bragg and Lewis McCord data that illustrated the same pattern from different angles. At 16:23 on day 14, General Holt called Colonel Reeves directly. Reeves relayed the content of the call to Elena at 1700, standing in the doorway of the systems room, with the expression of a man who has been in the Army for 38 years and has learned that good news and significant news are sometimes the same thing and always require the same response. Continue the work. The assumption architecture review is authorized, he said. Full audit, 14 facilities, 6-month timeline with a preliminary finding due at 90 days. He paused. He also said, and this is not language I expected from Marcus Holt, he said the methodology was rigorous and the conclusion was earned. She looked at Reeves. Rigorous and earned, she said. His exact words, Reeves said. She turned back to the terminal. Then we have 90 days, she said. You have 6 weeks remaining here, Reeves said. After that, where do you go? Bragg, she said. Then Lewis McCord, then wherever the audit process requires. He nodded. He started to leave. She said without turning, Colonel. Captain. The note in Okafor's file, she said. The one that documented appropriate professional deference to a female evaluator as a notable event. A pause. I saw that in the record, he said carefully. That note needs to not be a category that exists, she said. Treating a colleague professionally is not notable, it's the baseline. When we document it as notable, we're documenting that we expected otherwise. And when we document that we expected otherwise, we're confirming the expectation. She paused. That's a different finding from the simulation architecture, but it belongs in the same conversation. A long pause. Put it in the report, he said. It's already in the report, she said. She heard something that was almost a laugh, brief and quiet. Of course it is, he said, and left. On her last morning at Fort Carson, Elena arrived at the systems room at 0558. Maddox was already there. He was sitting in the folding chair with the third notepad open writing. He looked up when she came in and said nothing. Just closed the notepad and waited while she settled at the terminal and opened the day's work. They spent 2 hours on the final session. At the end of it, he closed the notepad for the last time and looked at her. What do I do with what's in here? He said. He meant the notepads, all 3 of them. What do you want to do with it? She said. He thought about it honestly. I want to change how I run this program, he said. Not because I was wrong, though I was. Because the people coming through this facility deserve better than what a biased training model can give them. They deserve to be seen accurately. And I want to be the instructor who can do that. She looked at him. She had met a lot of people in 8 years. She had walked into a lot of rooms and changed a lot of things, and walked out again and moved on to the next one. She had done all of it without requiring that the people she left behind understand what she had done or feel any particular way about it. But she found looking at Maddox now that she was glad. Not proud it wasn't about her. She was glad in the specific way that you are glad when something was worth the difficulty of it. When the long work and the early mornings, and the meeting with the general, and the note in the file, and the protein bar standing at the kitchen counter, when all of it had built towards something that was actually going to continue past the moment you walked out the door. Then do that, she said. He nodded. He stood up. He put the 3 notepads in a row on the desk beside the terminal and looked at them for a moment. You're going to be at Bragg next, he said. Yes. Bragg has some of the same patterns in the performance data, he said. You're going to walk into a facility that thinks it's the best in the program. The people there are going to be harder to reach than the people here. I know, she said. You'll reach them anyway, he said. It was not a compliment. It was a statement of fact made with the assurance of a man who has watched the method work from inside it. She looked at him. Get Navarro and Okafor into the advanced assessment track, she said. Don't wait for the formal audit to confirm what you already know. Already done, he said. Yesterday. She almost smiled, didn't quite. Good, she said. He picked up the notepads and his helmet and walked to the door. He stopped with his hand on the frame. Captain Cross, he said. She looked up. 9 Rangers blocked your path, he said, and not one of us came out of it the same. She held his gaze. No, she said. You didn't. He went through the door, and Elena Cross turned back to the terminal and spent the next 40 minutes writing the final entry in her Fort Carson observations, clear, complete, documented with the same precision and the same refusal to soften or inflate that had characterized every word she had written here, because the report was not finished until it was finished, and finished meant complete, and complete meant honest all the way to the last line. She saved it at 0912. She closed the terminal. She picked up her equipment case, the same one she had carried in through the south door on a Tuesday morning in November, when the room had gone quiet as she walked through it, and she walked out of the systems room for the last time. Down the corridor, past the briefing room, past the equipment room where she had told Hicks the truth about what made her angry and what made her practical. Past the main training floor where 9 Rangers had once stood completely certain of what they were about to see. Through the south door. Into the morning outside. She did not look back. She had work to do, a facility in Fort Bragg waiting for her arrival, and a 212-page analysis that was already changing the system she had spent 4 years building, because the best thing you could do for something you built was refuse to stop improving it, refuse to let your own investment in it blind you to what it still needed, refuse to be the kind of person who confused what they had made with the truth. She put her equipment case in the car and pulled out of the parking area and drove toward the highway. Behind her in the facility she had just left, 9 Rangers were already different from the soldiers they had been 2 weeks ago. A simulation system was entering an audit that would change how thousands of operators trained for the next decade. 2 soldiers who had been told for years that their scores were what they were had been placed in the advanced track where they belonged. And a master sergeant with 3 full notepads was sitting in his office reading from the first page, doing the slow and necessary work of becoming the instructor his unit needed him to be. Elena drove. The road ahead was long and the work was not done, and she had never once confused those 2 facts for reasons to slow down. She was the quiet person in the room. She was the one who understood the battlefield better than everyone in it, and she always moved forward.